They said wild Mustangs would never trust a man. But on a cold Wyoming dawn in 1872, a battle-scarred cowboy opened his cabin door to find the impossible. A gigantic black Mustang standing on his porch, not to attack, but to beg. At the horse's hooves lay a dying foal, fragile and gasping for its last breath. From that moment, Ethan McGraw was drawn into a struggle that would blur the line between myth and reality, where survival trust and a choice between the wild and the human world would change his life forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The gray light of dawn spread slowly over the high plains of Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1872. The land still clung to winter with a stubborn hand. Patches of snow lingered in shallow hollows, and a fine crust of frost glazed the grass blades that managed to stand against the wind. The horizon stretched wide and pale, a sheet of transparent blue that would brighten in time, but for now held the muted colors of steel and smoke. A thin mist clung close to the earth, rolling across the open prairie like a restless tide. Somewhere far off, the hoarse cry of a crow echoed over the desolate field, followed by silence broken only by the faint whistle of wind, squeezing through weather-worn fence posts and the eaves of a lonely homestead. This was the frontier at its most unforgiving, open, immense, and eerily empty. There were no voices, no wagons creaking down the trail, no herds grazing in sight. The silence was so complete, it pressed down on the listener like weight. It was a silence that spoke of distance, miles upon miles of land unbroken, except by stubborn tufts of sage and brittle weeds. And amid that emptiness, clinging to the edge of survival, stood a solitary cabin of rough-hewn logs and patched shingles. Its boards were scarred by decades of wind and storm, but it remained upright, a small defiance against the sweep of the plains. Inside lived a man who had chosen that solitude as both punishment and refuge. Ethan McGraw, a veteran of the late Civil War, had walked away from the battlefields with scars deeper than the puckered lines across his arms. He carried the war in his eyes, gray-blue and sunken, always measuring, always weary, as though still scanning for danger. His hair streaked with early gray, despite his 35 years, fell untended across his forehead. His beard was trimmed only when it itched beyond comfort. Life had whittled him lean, leaving sharp edges on his cheeks, lines etched across his brow, and a permanent droop to his shoulders. Yet for all that, his frame still bore the resilience of a soldier, the wiry muscle of a man accustomed to hardship and long marches. When the war ended, Ethan did not return to family. There was no one left. The farmstead in Missouri had been sold off to cover debts. The graves of kin lay scattered across different plots, some with headstones, some without. So he drifted westward, chasing distance more than opportunity, until he found this abandoned corner of the Wyoming plains. Here, he built what shelter he could 30 miles from the nearest town, and taught himself to live with silence. Years of isolation dulled the raw edges of grief, though the emptiness never left. What he had gained, however, was a fragile kind of peace. The land did not ask questions. The wind did not demand explanations. Out here, he could breathe. Each morning followed the same pattern. Ethan would rise from his rough cot, pull on a flannel shirt, faded almost white with wear, and shrug into a threadbare canvas coat. He would shove his feet into old boots, the rubber soles patched so many times they squeaked with each step, and push open the warped cabin door. For a moment, he would stand on the porch shoulders, hunched against the bite of dawn, and inhale deeply. The air was so cold, it stung his nostrils, but it cleared the fog of sleep. He would sweep his gaze across the yard and the leaning fence line, the empty corral, the stretch of barren field rolling to the dark outline of distant hills. If luck held, he might spot a coyote's tracks or the silhouette of a hawk perched on the lone cottonwood tree. Most mornings offered nothing at all, only the comfort of routine. After that brief inspection, he would retreat inside, light the stove, and brew coffee thin enough to see the bottom of the tin cup. This morning began no differently. Ethan shoved the door open with his shoulder and stepped out, pulling the collar of his coat higher against the cold. He yawned, rubbed at his eyes, and let his gaze wander across the familiar emptiness. His mind was already drifting to the prospect of bitter coffee, and perhaps a heel of stale bread to soften in it. He thought vaguely of chopping more wood, maybe checking the fence line later in the day. Nothing unusual, nothing demanding. Just another morning in the same quiet cycle. But the prairie had conspired otherwise. His eyes landed on a shape that should not have been there. At the very edge of the porch, where the frost still clung in silver patches, stood a horse. Not simply a horse, but a towering, impossible figure that filled his vision and sent his pulse hammering against his ribs. Ethan froze, one boot heel still lifted off the porch plank. His first instinct, sharpened by years of battle, was to retreat and snatch the rifle leaning against the wall just inside the door. But something in the sight rooted him to the spot. The creature was immense, larger than any horse he had ever seen. Its head, when raised, nearly brushed the sagging eaves of the porch roof. Muscles rippled beneath a coat as black as coal, every contour of its flanks carved like iron. A long mane, thick and untamed, streamed down its neck like storm clouds unraveling in the wind. Each exhale from its flared nostrils burst into the cold air in white plumes, as though smoke poured from a furnace. Its eyes, amber, burning, unnatural, fixed on him with a ferocity that made the air between them crackle. There was pain there, yes, but also something else. Urgency, demand, a plea that defied reason. Ethan's breath caught. His hand twitched toward the door, toward the gun that waited within, but the horse made no move to strike. It did not rear, did not charge. Instead, it lowered its massive head, the gesture almost deliberate, and held his gaze. The soldier in him recognized the tension of a standoff. The man in him sensed something stranger, an appeal wordless, yet unmistakable. Only then did he notice the second figure. At the horse's feet, half hidden in the churned dirt of the yard, lay a foal. Tiny compared to the giant that towered above the young creature, was collapsed in a heap of mud and matted hair. Its sides heaved in shallow, uneven rhythm. Each breath rattled through its chest as though pulled through water. A gash, dark with dried blood, marred one hind leg, and the rest of its body was soaked with dew and filth. Its head lolled weakly against the ground, eyes half closed, glazed with exhaustion. It looked less like life and more like the shadow of life, fading by their heartbeat. The sight struck Ethan harder than the giant's presence. He had seen death too many times not to recognize its imminence. The foal was dying. Foal was. And the massive horse, this impossible mythic creature, was standing guard over it. For a long breath, and the three remained frozen, the soldier, the giant, and the fragile spark between them. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His mind screamed for caution, for retreat. Wild mustangs avoided men bolted at the first scent of human presence. Yet this one had not fled. It had come here to his porch carrying a dying foal as though to present it at his feet. The black horse shifted its weight and took half a step forward. Its head dipped lower, eyes locking with his. There was no rage, no menace, only intensity. A silent command or perhaps a plea. It was absurd, unthinkable. But Ethan felt the truth as clearly as if spoken aloud. It was asking him for help. His breath left him in a shudder. Instinct told him to turn to bar the door and pray the beast moved on. But something deeper held him fast. He had lived through years of destruction and loss, buried too many comrades in unmarked earth. And now, in this wild and lonely place, a creature out of legend was asking him for mercy. The foal gave a faint twitch, a stutter of breath. The giant horse loomed closer, lowering its head until its muzzle nearly brushed the ground beside the fragile body. The sound that came from its throat was not a snort, not a roar, but a low rumble like a groan torn from the depths of grief. The sound shivered down Ethan's spine. He swallowed hard. His hand dropped away from the doorframe. "Lord, help me," he muttered under his breath, though his voice was barely more than a rasp. The Mustang's ears flicked at the sound. Its eyes glowed in the pale dawn, unblinking, unyielding. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt his own defenses falter. Against reason, against fear, he understood he could not walk away. He would have to try. The Wyoming dawn pressed around the silent witness to an impossible bargain. A man who had lost faith, a beast that should not exist, a dying foal clinging to the edge of breath. On that porch in the cold light of morning, everything ordinary fell away. What remained was raw, unlikely truth. The Mustang was begging him to save its child. For a long, taut heartbeat, Ethan remained frozen in the doorway, the cold air rushing against his face and the great black Mustang looming only a few steps away. Then the soldier's instincts kicked in. His hand jerked reflexively toward the doorframe, where the rifle leaned just inside a movement honed in 100 camps and ambushes. His chest tightened, every muscle bracing for violence. The pulse in his ears thudded like a drumline on the march. He could almost hear again the whistle of incoming shells, the shouted orders across a smoky battlefield. His mind screamed danger, the kind that demanded you shoot first or never shoot at all. But his gaze clung to the horse's eyes, and something inside him faltered. There was no bloodlust there, no wild gleam of a beast about to strike. The glow that shone in those amber depths was raw, desperate, almost unbearably human. The Mustang's posture was rigid, but not aggressive, head-lowered body coiled not for attack, but for endurance, as if restraining a force of instinct that begged to lash out. The veteran's training fought against his gut. He could end this tension in a second, drive the animal away, with the crack of a rifle reclaim his porch as the one safe corner of the world left to him. And yet he hesitated. "It isn't here to kill me," he thought. "It's here for the little one." The foal gave another shallow heave, sides fluttering like bellows about to collapse. Ethan's mouth went dry. Something older than instinct stirred within him, something that had once driven him to kneel beside wounded men on the field and press his hands against spurting arteries long after hope had fled. That same stubborn impulse now told him this dying scrap of life at his feet deserved at least a chance. His breath came in a harsh exhale. "All right," he muttered under his beard voice, low enough for no one but the frost to hear. He swallowed, glanced once at the rifle behind him, then back to the horse. "All right, I'll try. But don't you trample me into the dirt." The words were absurd, talking to a beast, but speaking them broke the deadlock inside him. He stepped out onto the porch, careful and slow, lowering his shoulders to appear smaller, less threatening. The boards creaked under his boots. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, every line of its body tense, but it did not move. Ethan took another step, then another, until the cold air filled his lungs like a dare. He was no longer a man hiding behind his door. He was walking into the unknown, He moved quickly once the decision was made, driven by the need to act before courage drained away. He ducked back inside, rummaging through his supplies with clumsy urgency. A bundle of straw saved for the old mule he had once owned was still stacked in a corner of the barn. He dragged it out, scattering yellow shafts across the frozen dirt. From a trunk, he dug out 2 wool blankets, frayed at the edges, but thick enough to hold warmth. An oil heater, dented but still serviceable. He wrestled onto the porch, setting it a safe distance from the straw. All the while, he felt the Mustang's gaze on him, a weight heavier than any rifle sight. When he spread the straw into a makeshift bed and draped the blankets across it, the giant horse stamped, once the thud echoing like thunder in the still morning. Its breath blasted white vapor as it tossed its head, nostrils flaring. Ethan raised both hands, palms out. "Easy now," he said softly. The words meant less to soothe the animal than to calm his own racing heart. "I'm not hurting it. You came here for help. Let me try." The beast pawed at the ground, but did not advance. It seemed to accept grudgingly this strange ritual. To Ethan, it felt like a pact sealed without words, a truce drawn in the frost between man and myth. The soldier crouched beside the foal at last. The tiny creature was lighter than he expected when he slid his arms under its chest and hindquarters. Its body sagged against him like a sack of wet reeds, the dampness of its coat seeping cold into his sleeves. He laid it gently onto the bed of straw, then knelt beside it, uncertain where to begin. He remembered the honey. A habit from the army, a spoonful dissolved in warm water, sometimes kept a fading comrade alert long enough for help to arrive. He hurried inside again, fetched a chipped tin cup, filled it with water from the kettle, and stirred in the last of his honey. The golden swirl dissolved, leaving a faint sweetness in the steam. Back on the porch, he dipped a wooden spoon, leaned close, and parted the foal's lips. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Just a taste. That's all." He let a few drops slide onto the animal's tongue. At first, nothing happened. The liquid ran down its chin, darkening the matted hair. Ethan tried again. And again. He tilted the spoon carefully, coaxing, murmuring encouragement, as though words could anchor the creature to life. "Stay with me, you hear? You've come this far. Don't quit now." The foal's ear flicked once, barely more than a tremor. Its jaw gave the faintest twitch. Was that a swallow? Or only the last spasms of exhaustion? Ethan could not tell. But he refused to stop. He fed another drop and another, repeating the ritual until the spoon was nearly dry. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cold. He pressed his hand lightly to the foal's chest. The heartbeat was a faint flutter, erratic, but still present. Better than nothing, he told himself. Better than nothing. A shadow swept across him, and Ethan realized the Mustang was moving. The giant circled the porch hooves, striking the earth in slow, deliberate rhythm. Its eyes never left him and the foal. Each time he leaned closer to tip the spoon, the horse gave a low rumble, not quite a growl, not quite a whinny. The sound carried warning. "I'm not hurting it," Ethan said again, louder this time, though his voice cracked. He kept one hand raised in a placating gesture while the other steadied the foal's head. "You want me to help? Let me do it." The great animal's gaze was unblinking, burning in the dim light. Its chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, mist swirling like smoke from a forge. Ethan felt the tension like a drawn bowstring. If he made one wrong move, if the horse mistook his intent, he could be crushed in an instant. But the Mustang did not strike. It continued its slow pacing, circling as though drawing an invisible line of protection. Ethan matched its vigilance with his own, every nerve alive, every movement deliberate. The day dragged toward dusk. the sun sinking behind the hills and painting the frost in fading gold. The temperature dropped, shadows lengthened, and the oil heater hummed faintly against the cold. By nightfall, the foal had shown no clear sign of recovery. No more twitches, no sound, only the barest rise and fall of its chest. Ethan sat back on his heels, fatigue weighing down his spine. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, eyes darting from the fragile body before him to the giant sentinel pacing beyond the porch rail. The stillness of evening pressed in, heavy and uncertain. He had done what he could: spread straw, offered warmth, fed honey water, but the outcome lay beyond him now. The foal hovered on the knife edge between life and death, and Ethan felt the weight of two worlds bearing down on him: the silent expectation of the colossal horse, and the stubborn ache in his own chest that refused to abandon hope. The night fell slowly over the Wyoming plains, stretching shadows across the cabin porch, until the little world Ethan had built narrowed to a circle of straw blankets and the shallow rise and fall of a dying foal's chest. The oil heater gave off a thin, uneven hum, its glow casting a weak halo of light against the boards. Beyond that circle of warmth, the land dissolved into fog and silence. Ethan knelt close to the foal's sleeves rolled and hands restless rubbing along its legs, massaging the stiff muscles of its chest and shoulders, doing anything to coax blood to move where the heart seemed too weary to send it. Again and again he pressed, paused, listened, then pressed again, as though his persistence alone might keep the fragile rhythm alive. The heartbeat beneath his palm was wild and uncertain. Sometimes it fluttered quick as a trapped bird, sometimes it faltered altogether, leaving an empty silence that made Ethan's own chest seize in panic. In those awful seconds, he would hold his breath, lean closer, waiting, begging in silence. Then just when he thought the foal had slipped away, a tremor would stir under his fingertips, a thin, irregular thump that sent relief crashing through him like a wave. Hours passed that way, each moment a balancing act on the edge of despair. The foal's breathing grew weaker as the cold pressed in. Each exhale was so faint, Ethan had to lower his ear to the muzzle to feel the whisper of air. Sometimes he caught nothing at all, and terror surged through him. He would shake the little body, gently rub harder, speak low and hoarse into the darkness. "Stay with me. Just one more breath. Come on now, don't quit." The heater rattled as it worked, the smell of hot oil thick in the air. The blankets grew damp with dew drifting in from the night, clinging cold against the straw. Every sound beyond the porch jolted his nerves: the scrape of hooves as the giant horse shifted in the mist, the sigh of wind through the fence posts, the creak of wood. Each noise might have been danger or warning or nothing at all, but in his taut state of waiting, they all carried the weight of omens. Ethan's shoulders cramped, his eyes burned from staring at the tiny chest, willing it to rise again and again. He dared not look away for long. The foal lived on the thinnest of margins, and it felt as if his attention was the only thread anchoring it to life. Thundercrest stood like a statue in the yard, a vast black silhouette etched against the veil of fog. The Mustang had not moved for hours, except to shift weight from one colossal hoof to another. Its breath drifted in clouds white against the dark, rising and vanishing like smoke from a forge. The amber glint of its eyes was the only constant light besides the dim heater. They burned in the mist, steady, patient, unblinking. It neither stamped nor snorted now. It simply watched. From Ethan's vantage, the creature might have been a carved guardian left at the gates of some forgotten temple, its sole purpose to keep vigil while a small and fragile soul fought for survival. At times, the sheer stillness of it unnerved him more than any roar could have. He stole glances at the looming figure and thought, This is no ordinary horse. This is something older, something that remembers more than men do. And yet, for all its enormity, it stood there in silence for the sake of a foal. And perhaps for the sake of him. Fatigue clawed at Ethan's body. His arms ached from rubbing his knees, from kneeling on hard boards. His head sagged heavy with memories he had tried to bury. Somewhere between one shallow heartbeat and the next, the past rushed up unbidden. He was back in the war, crouched beside a fallen comrade in the mud hands, pressing into a wound that bled too freely. He remembered the frantic rhythm of a pulse beneath his palms, then the faltering, then the dreadful stillness, when no more blood came. He remembered the faces of boys too young to fight, eyes wide with fear as they gasped their last. His own voice in those years had whispered the same useless words he spoke tonight. Hold on. Just one more breath. Don't leave me yet. The porch became a battlefield in his mind. The oil heater's sputter was the echo of gunfire, the fog, the drift of cannon smoke. And here under his hands lay not a soldier, but a foal. Yet the stakes felt no less. His jaw clenched as he whispered fiercely into the quiet, not this time. I'm not losing another one. You hear me, little one, I won't let you go. The animal became more than itself. It was a chance at redemption, a fragile opportunity to keep one spark from being snuffed out as so many had been before. The foal's survival became a vow, a line he could not retreat from. The hours dragged like years. Ethan tried spooning more honey water between the foal's lips. Most of it slid away, soaking the straw. The tiny mouth made no effort to swallow. His hands trembled as he tried again, the fear of futility gnawing at him. Just get through this night, he muttered. That's all. Just live till morning. Then maybe we'll have a chance. The foal's chest rose in jerks, regular, frighteningly shallow. Twice it stopped altogether, leaving Ethan frozen in terror, until a thin shudder came restarting the rhythm. Each time his breath caught in relief so sharp it hurt. Time lost meaning. The night stretched into an endless battle fought in whispers and trembling hands, with no weapons, but warmth and persistence. Ethan's head nodded forward, then jerked up again as he forced himself awake. He could not afford sleep, not while life itself balanced on a knife edge before him. At last, the eastern sky paled. Dawn crept back over the plains, painting the mist in faint silver. Ethan's eyes burned his throat raw from hours of murmured pleas. He had begun to think the morning would find only silence on the straw. Then, as the first pale light touched the porch, the foal stirred. A twitch of the ear so slight, he thought he imagined it. Then the mouth-moved tongue shifting against his spoon. Ethan leaned closer, barely daring to breathe. He tilted the cup, let a single drop of honey water fall. The foal swallowed. It was a small, uncertain motion, but undeniable. The throat worked once weakly, drawing the sweetness down instead of spilling it away. A beat later, the chest expanded in a breath deeper than any taken all night. The rhythm steadied, not strong, but no longer so erratic. The eyes flickered open a crack, revealing a dull glint of life, where before there had been only haze. Ethan's heart surged. He let out a breath that shuddered into something close to a laugh. "You stubborn little fighter," he whispered hoarsely. "You're not ready to give up, are you?" Beyond the porch, the giant Mustang raised its head. For the first time since nightfall, it made a sound, a low-rising whinny, soft yet resonant, carrying into the cold morning air. It was not a cry of challenge, but of recognition, an answer to the fragile spark that had refused to die. Ethan sat back on his heels, tears stinging his eyes. Against all reason, against all odds, the foal had chosen to fight. The long night was not victory, not yet, but it was survival. And survival was enough to keep hope alive. The morning sun climbed, steadily pouring pale gold across the frost-hardened ground. Ethan sat on the porch steps, staring at the foal curled on the straw bed. Its breaths came in uneven, but steadier pulls, the chest rising with a rhythm less frantic than the night before. That single swallow of honey water at dawn had lit a flame of hope in him. But as the minutes passed, he realized hope alone was not enough. He had kept the foal alive through the darkness, but beyond warmth and whispered prayers, he had little else to give. The truth pressed on him with growing weight. Without proper skill, the little creature would die. His hands were the hands of a soldier, not a healer. He could rub limbs and warm blankets, but infection, fever, blood loss, those things he could not fight alone. Ethan stood abruptly, grabbed his coat from the rail, and strode toward the lean-to where his old bay mare dozed. The horse raised her head as he threw the saddle across her back, cinching straps with more force than necessary. He muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to the foal he was leaving behind. "Hold on, kid. Just a little longer. I'll fetch help." Within minutes, he was riding hard across the rutted track toward Dry Hollow, 30 miles of mud and stone, stretching between him and the only chance of salvation. Hooves struck through patches of thawing ground, sending clods of dirt flying. Wheels of abandoned wagons had carved deep scars into the trail, now filled with water that splashed cold against his boots. Every jolt rattled his bones, but he pressed the mare forward, jaw-clenched, eyes fixed on the pale horizon. Anxiety gnawed at him with every mile. He pictured the foal's chest slowing, pictured it stilling forever before he returned. Yet alongside that fear glimmered the fragile spark of dawn's miracle, the tiny swallow proof that life had not given up. It was enough to drive him faster. Dry Hollow was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings strung along a single street: saloon, general store, marshal's office, blacksmith. And at the far end, the modest two-room clinic of Dr. Abigail Rowe. Abigail was known as an anomaly in the territory. In a world dominated by men and their fists, she carried herself with steady calm and a leather satchel of instruments. She had mended ranch hands, crushed under wagons, stitched drunks, stabbed in barroom brawls, and perhaps more unusually treated animals when no vet could be found. Mules, oxen, cattle, even the occasional wounded hawk brought by a curious boy. She had no official license for beasts, but her knowledge was practical and her hands sure. People who laughed at the idea of a lady doctor still came knocking when blood flowed and time was short. When Ethan burst through her door, dusty and wild-eyed, she looked up from a ledger, her brow furrowed at the sight of him. "A Mustang foal," he blurted before he could steady his breath. "It's dying on my porch. And its sire, or damn, I don't know, some monster of a horse big as I've ever seen brought it to me. You have to come." Abigail's lips pressed into a thin line. "A giant Mustang," she repeated slowly, skepticism clear. "Mr. McGraw, I know the war left men with strange visions. Are you sure this isn't, it's real?" His voice cracked raw from the ride. "And if you don't believe me, fine. But the foal's small, gray, bleeding bad from the leg, he hasn't got long. I did what I could. Honey water, blankets. But it won't be enough." Her doubt softened at the desperation in his tone. She saw no madness in his eyes, only fatigue and fear. Without another word, she snapped her ledger shut, rose, and began packing her satchel with bottles cloth and the few crude tools she owned. "Then we'd best hurry," she said simply. They rode hard together. Abigail seated upright on a chestnut mare, her satchel slung across her shoulder. The trail back to Ethan's ranch wound through foothills where snow still lingered in shadow. She kept her silence for much of the way, though she studied the man beside her with quick glances. His face was drawn tight, his eyes never straying from the path ahead. There was no theatrics in his bearing, no wild embellishment. Whatever story he had told, he believed it with every fiber of his being. When they neared his land, Abigail slowed. Her eyes caught the ground beside the trail hoof prints pressed deep into the soil. They were broader, heavier than any horse she had seen, the edges sunk firm into the earth. She reined in for a moment, staring, then met Ethan's gaze. He only nodded once, grim and silent. She asked no further questions. The ranch lay quiet when they arrived. The foals still lay on the straw bed, wrapped in blankets, sides moving in shallow rhythm. Ethan dropped from his horse and knelt at once. Still breathing, he whispered, relief flooding him. Abigail dismounted quickly, set her satchel beside the straw, and went to work. She touched the foal's neck, feeling for a pulse, then slid her hand along its ribs for warmth. Her brow furrowed. Weak, she muttered. Very weak, but alive. She examined the wound on the hind leg, a ragged gash crusted with dried blood, edges swollen with the first signs of infection. She pulled a vial from her bag, filled a needle with a measured dose of antibiotic, and steadied her hand. Hold him still, she instructed. Ethan braced the foal gently, whispering reassurance, though his own heart thundered. The foal flinched as the needle pricked its skin, gave a faint kick, then sagged back into stillness. Abigail wasted no time. She tied a strip of cloth around its foreleg, slid in a crude tube, and rigged a pouch of fluid to drip slowly down. Dehydrated, she said. This will help. Next, she uncorked a flask of strong liquor, poured it over strips of clean cloth, and pressed them against the wound. The smell stung Ethan's eyes. The foal twitched, but did not resist. Abigail wrapped the leg tightly, binding the cloth firm. Her hands were quick and confident, practiced from years of tending to men and animals alike. All the while, Ethan hovered close, offering his strength when needed, steadying the foal's head, murmuring encouragement in a hoarse voice. His eyes followed every movement, fear and gratitude, tangled in equal measure. When Abigail finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. The foal's breathing had steadied, still faint, but less erratic. Its small body seemed to sink into the warmth of the straw, as if surrendering to the treatment. Abigail exhaled, finally meeting Ethan's gaze. If you keep him warm, keep feeding him little by little, and tend that wound every day, he has a chance. It won't be easy and he might still slip, but the odds are no longer hopeless. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, and the weight on his chest lifting. He felt his knees weaken and steadied himself against the porch rail. For the first time since the black Mustang had appeared at his door, he believed survival was more than a fragile thread. It was possible. He managed a rough whisper. Thank you. Abigail packed away her instruments, but her attention flicked to the open field beyond. Is the other one still near? She asked carefully. As if summoned by the question, a shadow moved at the edge of the mist. Thundercrest emerged from the tree line, massive and spectral mane rippling in the breeze. Its eyes locked on the porch, burning with intensity. The Mustang saw the needles, saw the human crouched over its foal, and let out a low, rolling growl that vibrated across the ground. Its muscles bunched, hooves stamping once in warning. Abigail froze, but her hands did not falter. She kept the bandage firm, her movements calm and steady. Ethan raised his arms slowly, palms outward. Easy, big fella, he called softly. She's helping. Look at your young one, breathing easier already. She's no threat. For a tense moment, the great horse stood, rigid eyes blazing. Then its ears twitched back, its breath huffed, and it stepped away, retreating a few paces. It lingered at the far end of the yard, watching the fury in its gaze tempered into wary acceptance. When the foal sighed in a deeper, steadier rhythm, Thundercrest lowered its massive head, the fire in its stance softening at last. Ethan looked from the foal to the horse and felt something shift within him, the sense of standing at the center of an unspoken pact. Human wild beast and fragile life bound together by the faintest spark of hope. And for the first time, hope no longer felt like a stranger. For 3 days, the cabin porch became a sick room, the straw bed a battlefield no less tense than any Ethan had fought upon. Under Abigail's guidance, he fed the foal in careful increments, cleaned the wound twice daily, and watched for fever as though the rise of a single degree might be the toll of death's bell. The oil heater burned almost without pause, leaving the cabin reeking of kerosene, and blankets lay in a tangle of damp folds from constant rearrangement. But slowly, undeniably, the signs of life gathered strength. The foal's breath steadied. Its eyes fluttered open for longer stretches, sometimes tracking Ethan as he moved across the porch. The once shallow chest rose with more conviction, as though the small lungs had remembered their purpose. When Abigail declared the worst moment had passed, Ethan allowed himself a breath deeper than any he had taken in weeks. On the morning of the 4th day, he made his decision. He fetched the old handcart from the barn, its wheels squealing faintly from rust, and lined the bed with straw and wool. With as much gentleness as his scarred hands could manage, he lifted the foal into his arms, marveling again at how insubstantial it felt, like a spirit wrapped in damp hide. He set it on the cart, tucked the blanket snugly around its narrow body, and wheeled it out into the yard, where sunlight spread across the frost-hardened earth. His heartbeat quickened as he positioned the cart in the open space. "If Thundercrest doesn't accept this," he muttered under his breath, "everything we've done will have been for nothing." He stepped back, hands hovering near the cart, but not touching, and waited. The answer came in shadow. From the far line of cottonwoods, a figure emerged, vast and dark, blotting the horizon like an omen. Thundercrest moved with a deliberate slowness, each hoof sinking deep into the damp soil, each step shaking the earth as though a storm approached. Sunlight struck its mane, sending black strands whipping in the breeze like banners. Ethan held his breath. The Mustang drew close until its shadow swallowed the cart. It lowered its head, the great muzzle brushing the air above the foal. The sound of its breath filled the yard, a heavy rumbling thunder that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The foal stirred. Its ears twitched, then its head lifted weakly. With a faint sigh, it turned toward the massive presence, nostrils quivering. A soft whimper escaped its throat, and Ethan thought he saw recognition flicker in those dim eyes. Thundercrest leaned closer, touched its nose to the bandaged leg, and inhaled deeply. For a moment, Ethan was certain the beast would recoil, enraged by the smell of man's medicine clinging to its young. Instead, the Mustang stood still, the great chest expanding with a sound like rolling thunder. Ethan remained motionless, heart-hammering. He did not dare interfere. This was their moment, not his. After several breaths, Thundercrest lifted its head. Its eyes molten amber swung to Ethan. The soldier froze beneath that gaze. He expected anger, expected the wild rage of a parent reclaiming what had been stolen. But none came. Instead, the Mustang took 2 deliberate steps back, planting itself like a monument at the edge of the yard. It made no move to reclaim the foal. It did not beckon, did not drive Ethan away. It simply stood watching. And in that stillness, Ethan understood this was no surrender, no defeat. It was a gesture of trust, a handing over as solemn as any oath spoken between men. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat, and knotted voice hushed. "I'll look after him. You have my word." Later, as he sat beside the foal, he noticed how dust clung to its legs. Every attempt at movement stirred small clouds of dirt, painting its ankles gray-brown. Ethan chuckled quietly, the sound strange in his own ears after so long without laughter. "Dustfoot," he murmured, brushing a hand across the tiny fetlocks. "That's what I'll call you? Dustfoot. You've carried the dust of this prairie from the start, and you'll carry it still when you're strong again." The foal blinked as though acknowledging the christening. Ethan smiled, faint but genuine. He had not spoken a name with affection in years. The days turned to lessons in perseverance. Each morning, Ethan coaxed Dustfoot to his feet, steadying the trembling legs with his hands. At first, the effort lasted only seconds. The knees would buckle, the body crumple back to straw. But Ethan lifted him again, patient, relentless. "Up you go, little one," he said each time, voice low, coaxing. No soldier quits on the first stumble. Gradually, the sessions lengthened. Dustfoot managed 2 steps and then 3 before falling. Soon he wobbled in circles on the porch ears, flicking as though bewildered by the strange new strength inside his body. His curiosity grew with his stamina. He sniffed at the porch posts, lipped the iron latch of the gate, prodded at Ethan's boots with a damp nose. From the distance came Thundercrest's rumble, a sound halfway between warning and encouragement. Whenever Dustfoot stumbled, the giant horse pawed the earth, tossing its mane with a sound like grief. Ethan would raise a hand toward the horizon. "He's fine, just finding his legs." Same as we all had to. Each evening, Dustfoot stood longer, walked farther, until one afternoon he trotted 3 unsteady steps without falling. Ethan's chest swelled as though he were watching his own child take a first stride. Pride burned through the fatigue and solitude, warming him more than any fire could. Thundercrest remained, but its presence began to change. In the early days, it had loomed close, never more than a stone's throw from the porch, its eyes fixed with unyielding vigilance. But as Dustfoot grew steadier, the Mustang's visits shortened. It would appear at dawn, a vast silhouette in the fog, watch silently as the foal stretched and wobbled on his new legs and then drift away into the hills before noon. At first, Ethan felt unease. Each departure left him strangely hollow, as though the yard itself grew emptier when the black shadow vanished. But with time, he began to see the meaning. This was not abandonment. It was permission. Thundercrest was ceding space, granting its young the right to remain in human care. One morning, Ethan stood at the fence and watched the great horse fade into mist mane, streaming behind like smoke. Dustfoot dozed at his feet, legs folded neatly beneath him. Ethan rested a hand on the foal's back and whispered, "He trusts us now. You and me." It was a bittersweet knowledge. Joy at the gift entrusted to him. Sorrow at the slow retreat of a legend he had never dreamed to meet. In the weeks that followed, the routine became almost ordinary. Dustfoot's strength grew daily. His legs carried him in small, joyful bursts across the yard. He discovered the cottonwood tree, chewing its bark mischievously until Ethan chased him off. He pawed at water troughs splashed in mud and returned each evening to collapse in a heap of straw by the porch. Ethan followed his antics with weary patience and a heart that no longer felt quite so heavy. Where once silence had been his only companion, now the clatter of hooves and the soft nickers of a growing foal filled his days. And though Thundercrest's visits dwindled, the giant's absence was never complete. Now and again, when the wind shifted, Ethan swore he heard the deep rumble of its call echoing from the hills. Dustfoot would lift his head, ears pricked, but then settle back beside Ethan with quiet trust. The bond was fragile, improbable, but real. A man scarred by war, a foal who had teetered on the brink of death, and a legend who had chosen for reasons beyond reason to entrust one life to another. Ethan sat on the porch at sunset, watching Dustfoot nose through a pile of hay, and thought, this is what it means to be needed again. It began with whispers. In Dry Hollow's saloon, where whiskey loosened tongues and fear sharpened stories, men leaned close across tables to talk of a beast seen near the McGraw ranch. One swore he'd glimpsed it at dawn, black as midnight and taller than a steer eyes burning like coals. Another claimed it had left hoof prints the size of dinner plates in the soft earth by the creek. Soon the tale grew. The monster could crush fences in a single stride, scatter whole herds in panic, even breathe smoke like some outlawed devil horse. By the week's end, every rancher within 20 miles had heard the story. It leapt from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith's forge to the stagecoach stop. Dry Hollow was a small place, and stories thrived like fire in dry grass. What began as curiosity quickly soured into dread. Men pictured their cattle trampled, their mares driven to panic, their livelihoods undone by one colossal Mustang haunting the prairie. Fear was a contagion, and it spread swiftly. Ethan heard it all secondhand, riding in for supplies. He caught the sidelong glances, the muttered words that died when he drew near. He said nothing, though the heat rose in his chest. He knew enough of soldiers' talk to recognize when rumor had turned to hostility. Jedediah Cole gave the hostility a voice. Cole was the wealthiest man in the county, owner of sprawling herds and more acres than most men could count. His word carried weight in Dry Hollow, not because of wisdom, but because his coin and his fists both fell heavy. He was a man who believed the prairie belonged to him and took offense at anything that suggested otherwise. When the tale of the black Mustang reached him, his temper flared like a prairie fire. One evening in the saloon, with half the town crowded inside, he slammed his whiskey glass down and declared, "If that beast lingers near our herds, I'll not wait for it to bring ruin. I'll call the federal cavalry myself. They'll put a bullet in its skull before it crushes a single calf." The word struck the room like a gavel. Men muttered agreement, nodding grimly. A few tried to laugh it off, but the laughter was thin. Fear had already seeded itself too deeply. Farmers who had lost sleep, imagining hooves pounding through their pastures, found relief in Cole's threat, even if it meant blood. Ethan, standing in the corner with his sack of flour, felt every word like a knife. His fists clenched until his knuckles whitened. He longed to shout that the horse had harmed no one, that it had come not as predator, but as supplicant bringing its young to be saved. But he knew the crowd. Words would not sway them. Defiance would only mark him as a fool or a liar. So he slipped out quietly, anger burning like coals beneath his ribs. 2 days later, Marshal Hank Duval arrived at his ranch. The marshal was not a cruel man, nor easily swayed by rumor, but his duty was to the people of Dry Hollow. He came at dawn, rein slack in one hand, his bay gelding pacing steady across the frost. Ethan met him at the gate, Dustfoot watching sleepily from the porch. "Morning, Ethan," Duval said, tipping his hat. "You know why I'm here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I reckon I do." The marshal dismounted with a grunt, boots crunching against the dirt. "Laws plain about wild stock. Horses without brand belong to the open land. But what you describe, this giant Mustang..." He shook his head. The laws never accounted for such a thing. He rested his hand on the fence post, eyes narrowing. "Folk are uneasy. Some think their herds are in danger. If enough voices cry hazard, the territorial office will listen. And when the government sends men to deal with a beast, they don't come with ropes. They come with rifles. The words sank heavy as stones. Ethan glanced toward Dustfoot, then toward the hills where Thundercrest had once stood. He saw the vision too clearly. Soldiers in blue coats riding with rifles cocked a giant horse crashing under a hail of bullets. Duval's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "I've no quarrel with you, Ethan. But you'd best think what you aim to do before it's decided for you." That night, Ethan sat on the porch with Dustfoot curled at his side. Moonlight silvered the plains, touching the fences and cottonwoods with ghostly sheen. The foal's breaths came soft, and even a comforting rhythm in the quiet. But Ethan's own heart knew no peace. He stared at the empty horizon where Thundercrest had once stood vast and immovable. He remembered the night the horse had lowered its head in desperate plea, remembered the eyes that had begged him to save a life. That trust had been sacred, weightier than any oath sworn in war. And now he thought bitterly, "I'm to repay it by standing aside while they hunt him down." The image of the Mustang collapsing under gunfire made his stomach twist. Worse still was the thought of Dustfoot dragged away, penned, perhaps broken to harness, stripped of the fragile freedom he had fought so hard to preserve. He pressed his hands to his face, groaning softly. "I can't let that be the end," he whispered. "Not after all we've endured." Through the long hours of the night, he wrestled with it, turning the problem over and over. When dawn came pale and merciless, his decision was made. He would not wait for Cole's men or government rifles. He would act first. Long ago, by the fire of a winter camp, Ethan had heard a story from a Shoshone guide. The man spoke of a hidden valley beyond the northern ridges, a place where wild mustangs gathered away from the eyes of white men. A valley sheltered by cliffs, watered by a spring cloaked in cottonwoods. Few dared the treacherous path there, but those who reached it said herds thrived unseen. Ethan clung to the memory now as though it were scripture. Only in such a place could Dustfoot be safe from Cole, from townsfolk, from the very law. Only there might Thundercrest rejoin his young without fear of rifles. The plan formed with grim clarity. He would prepare a wagon at dawn, line it with straw-load blankets, food, and the soft rope he used when guiding Dustfoot. He would set out before the neighbors stirred, before curious eyes could mark his departure. The journey would be hard, but safety lay at the end of it. He looked at Dustfoot lying across the straw by the porch legs, twitching in dream. His throat tightened. "You've made this place your home, haven't you, boy?" he murmured. "But home isn't safe for you anymore. I can't hold you here while men sharpen their bullets." The foal stirred, lifting his head as though hearing. Ethan reached out, stroked the damp mane, and forced a smile. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Tomorrow we go. I'll take you where you belong." His voice cracked, but his resolve did not. As the night deepened, he sat in silence, the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. He thought of Thundercrest fading into mist, of Abigail's sure hands, binding wounds, of Duval's warning, and of Cole's threat echoing through the saloon. All of it converged into one truth: to protect Dustfoot, he must let go of the life he had begun to build. When at last he rose and shut the cabin door, his mind was set. At dawn, he would lead the foal away into the wild, into danger, perhaps into legend, but never into betrayal. The night before had been restless, but when the first thin gray of dawn seeped across the horizon, Ethan McGraw was already at work. His hands moved with a soldier's efficiency, though his heart weighed heavier than the packs he loaded. He brought the old wagon from the shed, its wheels creaking in protest, and lined the bed with straw and folded blankets. Beside it, he placed a canvas sack of dry rations, a water skin, and his weather-worn army knife. the same blade he had carried through the war, dulled by years, but never abandoned. He paused once, staring at the ranch house. The roof sagged, the porch leaned, and the paint had long ago faded to silver gray. It had been his shelter for years, the place where solitude had carved deep into his bones. Now he looked at it with the ache of farewell. He did not know if he would return, and if he did, he knew it would never feel the same. Dustfoot resisted when he tried to lead him into the wagon. The young colt balked, hooves scraping against the dirt, eyes wide with suspicion. Ethan murmured softly, stroking the damp mane. "Easy, boy. It's just for a while. Trust me." After a long moment of hesitation, Dustfoot yielded, stepping onto the straw bed. He wobbled, then stood still, ears twitching, gaze fixed on Ethan, as if weighing the truth of his words. Ethan climbed onto the driver's seat, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue. The wagon lurched forward. The wheels groaned over stone and rutted earth, carrying man and colt away from the homestead into the uncertain light of morning. Behind them, the ranch shrank to a shadow against the prairie. Ahead stretched the untraveled road. The trail was merciless. The wagon jolted on uneven ground, rattling like bones in a drum. Dust flew in swirling clouds, coating Ethan's coat and stinging his eyes. Each rut sent the wagon lurching, and Dustfoot's staggered legs trembling with the effort of balance. Yet the colt did not panic. His breath came fast, but he held his ground, learning the rhythm of the wagon's sway as though it were another test of strength. Ethan stole glances over his shoulder every few moments, one hand steady on the reins, the other half raised as if ready to catch the colt should he fall. "Steady, Dustfoot," he murmured. "You'll be all right. Not much farther." His words were little more than gravelly whispers, but the tone carried calm. The world around them shifted as they pressed deeper into the foothills. Coyotes called from unseen ridges. Once the mournful howl of wolves echoed faintly through the crisp air, and Ethan's hand instinctively brushed the knife at his belt. But nothing came near. The wagon rattled on, pulled by his tired mare. The prairie grass thinned into scrub and stone. Low shrubs clung to the earth, their roots gripping, as though to resist the sweep of wind. Soon the flat land broke into ridges, walls of rock, rising like gray sentinels. The path narrowed, hemmed in by cliffs, forcing the wagon into a slow, grinding climb. Each turn carried them farther from the human world, deeper into silence. Ethan felt the weight of it in his chest. This was not just distance. It was separation. By the time the sun broke free of the ridges, painting the world in molten gold, the wagon rolled through a gap and into a valley hidden from all but the boldest travelers. The air shifted instantly, softer, greener. A clear brook whispered across the meadow, curling around stands of cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered in the breeze. Tall grass rippled like a sea of bronze beneath the dawn. Birds rose from the branches in sudden flight, their wings flashing against the sky. Ethan halted the wagon, breath catching. He felt as though he had stepped into a sanctuary, a place the world had forgotten. He turned to Dustfoot, who stood braced in the wagon, ears pricked high. The colt lifted his nose, sniffing the air with wonder. His eyes gleamed brighter than Ethan had ever seen, reflecting the valley's light. Ethan leaned close and whispered, "If there's a place made for you, it's here." Dustfoot nickered softly, as if in answer. The answer to that promise came suddenly. From the cliffs above, a shadow detached itself, massive against the dawn. Thundercrest appeared, black mane flung wild by the wind muscles, rippling with each deliberate step. The stallion stood like a statue carved from obsidian eyes, burning with the same ancient fire Ethan remembered from that first encounter. Ethan froze awe, rooting him where he sat. Against the morning glow, the horse seemed more than flesh, a creature born of legend, larger than life, etched against the sky, as if painted by the hand of myth itself. Dustfoot quivered in the wagon, a shudder passing through his legs. Then he released a small tentative whinny, soft but clear, carrying across the valley like a child calling to a parent. Thundercrest answered with silence, only the proud lift of his head and the echo of breath rolling deep in his chest. Ethan swallowed hard. He felt he was intruding on a sacred rite, a ceremony older than any law or fence. His hands trembled on the reins. Slowly he moved to the back of the wagon. His fingers worked at the knot of the rope looped loosely around Dustfoot's neck. He slipped it free, the soft fiber falling away. Then he stepped back several paces, giving space, his voice low and steady. "Your choice now, boy," he said. "No ropes, no orders. Do as your heart tells you." The valley fell utterly still. Only the trickle of the brook and the steady breath of the horses filled the air. Ethan stood motionless, feeling the weight of his vow. He had fought through war and loss, through loneliness and fear. But this moment was not his to command. He had done all he could. The rest belonged to nature, to freedom, to the bond between a colt and the wild that birthed him. Dustfoot lowered his head, then stepped forward, hooves crunching softly on stone. The colt advanced in halting strides, each step measured ears, flicking nervously but drawn onward. When he neared the base of the cliff, Thundercrest descended his massive form, casting a long shadow. Dustfoot lifted his head, stretched his muzzle, and touched nose to the stallion's. The contact was brief, but electric breath mingling in clouds of steam. They stood locked together, motionless as though speaking in a tongue older than words. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He dared not move, not even to breathe too loudly for fear of shattering the fragile communion. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Thundercrest exhaled a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground. He turned, powerful muscles rolling beneath his hide, and began to climb the slope away from the valley floor. Dustfoot watched, ears straining forward, eyes fixed on the receding form. His body trembled, every line of him caught between longing and hesitation. One step forward, hooves scraping rock as though he might follow. Ethan's chest clenched. He braced for the emptiness that would follow, for the sight of the colt, disappearing into legend's shadow. But Dustfoot halted. He lingered one heartbeat longer, then swung his head back toward Ethan. Their eyes met across the valley floor. With sudden decision, Dustfoot wheeled and galloped, not after Thundercrest, but toward the man who had carried him through nights of fever and hunger. He skidded to a halt against Ethan's legs, pressing his muzzle into the folds of his coat. Ethan dropped to his knees, arms wrapping around the colt's neck, his breath caught, breaking into a ragged laugh that was half a sob. Tears he had buried for years burned hot against his cheeks. "You chose me," he whispered. "God help me, you chose me." High on the ridge, Thundercrest paused. The giant stallion turned his head, eyes glinting with firelight caught in the dawn. For a heartbeat, the gaze met Ethan's. No anger, no regret, only solemn acknowledgement. Ethan understood it as clearly as if it had been spoken. A covenant had been made. Not of ownership, but of trust. The wild had given its gift, and the man had proven worthy. Then Thundercrest turned away, mane whipping, and vanished beyond the crest of stone. The valley was silent again, save for the brook's murmur and Dustfoot's steady breathing. Ethan held the colt close, his heart hammering with awe, grief and joy all bound together. For the first time since the war, he felt the fullness of life press against him, not as duty or burden, but as a gift freely given. The sun rose higher, gilding the meadow in light. Man and colt stood together, a bond sealed in freedom and choice, while the legend of the black Mustang faded into the mountains, leaving behind not absence, but a silent promise. They returned at a gentler pace than they had gone. By late afternoon, the old ranch rose out of the wavering heat like something remembered. The roof line stooped the porch, leaning into the wind, as if listening for news. Ethan reined in at the gate and let the wagon roll to a stop. Dustfoot stood quietly in the bed, ears-pricked eyes bright with the day's long light. There were no halters, no straps, no stall waiting, only the open yard, a trough brimming with water, and a low heap of hay set beneath the porch eaves. "Down you get," Ethan said softly. The colt hopped to the ground and stood a moment testing the remembered earth. Then he trotted a slow circle of the yard, sniffed the trough, drank, and wandered toward the cottonwood where the shade fell deepest. By sunset, he had curled up in the familiar corner beside the steps legs, tucked chin resting on the floorboard that had once been his sickbed. Ethan eased into the rocker boots on the rail and watched the colt's sides rise and fall. The knowledge came to him with a quiet certainty. He did not try to disturb the bond between them, did not depend on rope or fence. It existed because the animal chose to return, because he chose to stay. In the days that followed, Ethan held to that truth. He kept his hands off the bridle pegs, left the hammer where it lay, and made no move to raise a pen. He checked the old wound now, and then peeling the cloth washing, drying, and then stepped back. He never threw a saddle on Dustfoot's back, never drove a nail into a hoof, never scratched a name into any ranch book. When he spoke of the colt, and he almost never did, he said "my friend," and the words felt truer than any claim of ownership. The change altered the ranch in ways that were hard to name. The gate stayed unlatched. The water trough was always full. A half-salt lick lay under the cottonwood, a courtesy more than a tether. The place became a seam between world's porch boards and coffee, and the creak of a rocker on one side, grasses and wind, and the untidy chorus of wild things on the other. Dustfoot ran that seam like a thread, stitching it together each day and each night. One morning, after a night of unsettled wind, Ethan stepped out with his tin cup and paused mid-sip. At the base of the cottonwood, someone or something had set a tight bundle of wild herbs. He knew the smell before he crouched sharp and clean, a ghost of resin in the air. Mountain sage with a sprig of rabbit brush, bound with a strip of dried grass. Beside it, pressed deep in the damp ground, lay a single half-moon print so large it seemed a trick of light. Ethan knelt and touched the edge of the track. The dirt crumbled warm under his finger. "You came," he said, so quiet, even the wind might miss it. There was no spectacle to it, no trumpet call, no crash of hooves, just a message that needed no words. He set his palm lightly against the earth inside the print and felt the strangest sense of continuance, as if a trail he could not see ran through that hollow and out into the sage beyond. He did not call for Dustfoot. He did not move the herbs. He only stood hat in hand and let the morning acknowledge itself. Dustfoot found the bundle on his own. The colt nosed it, sneezed, and then began to circle the cottonwood with an energy that tugged at Ethan's ribs. He gave those small, tender nickers that had once been questions and now sounded like answers. The rest of that day, he ranged the fence line, and the low draw beyond pausing, often head-lifted ears cupped toward the hills. Late in the afternoon, he returned to the tree and stood so still, breathing in the faintest frail scent, that Ethan could almost see a line stretch between mother and son, tight and shining in the sun. "Go on if you need to," Ethan said, though he knew the colt would not. Dustfoot flicked an ear and stepped closer to the porch. Time slid forward, measured not by calendars, but by the colt's body. Dustfoot filled out in quiet increments, ribs fading under a new lay of muscle hunches, rounding chest broadening. His coat took on a luster that threw back evening light, his mane turned slick and windy. He moved with a grace that had once belonged only to breath and now belonged to stride. When the wind leaned down the draw and combed the grass, he would plant his hooves and lift his head until the whites of his eyes flashed a look not of fear, but of inheritance. The wildness didn't leave him. It settled deeper the way fire goes to coals. Ethan learned the feel of that gaze and did not try to soften it. You could gentle a horse he knew. You could not gentle a horizon. He accepted that Dustfoot would always stand with one ear toward the porch and one toward the hills, ready to take counsel from both. Night taught him new lessons, many times after the day had spent itself and the porch lamp burned low. Ethan would sit with his back against the post, the rocker empty, listening to the big blank country. At first, the silence seemed whole. Then, as his ears adjusted, he heard a sound approach from very far off, distinct as a name. Hoofbeats slow, deliberate, resonant. Not the quick forebeat of the colt's canter, but a measured drum so deep it drew breath into time with it. It would roll down the draw, hesitate at the edges of the yard, and turn away again, as if a shadow traced the fence line like the fingertip of a map maker, and then withdrew before it crossed onto the porch's domestic ground. Ethan never rose. He never set lantern to high flame or called into the dark. He only listened, smiling into the night where no one could see it, and said under his breath, "I know you're out there." The words carried no claim. They were acknowledgement and gratitude, and a kind of prayer all folded into one. Sometimes in answer, the wind moved through the cottonwood with a sound like a stallion's sigh. The weeks became a season. Jedediah Cole's threats dried up for lack of spectacle. The newspapers found other worries. The marshal stopped riding by except to tip his hat from the road. The ranch settled into a rhythm that did not quite belong to any ledger. In that rhythm, Ethan found a kind of rest he had not known since before the war, not because the world had grown kinder, but because something in him no longer stood alone against it. On an evening of enormous sky blue turning to pewter, and then to ember, Ethan sat on the step with his cup cooling in his hands. Dustfoot stood near, head over the railing, mouthing the splinters the way he had as a half-ghost in blankets months before. Across the yard, the cottonwood threw a long shadow. Far beyond, where the prairie fell away, and the light gathered in the low places, a shape paused and then eased along the ridge, black against a red-gold seam. Ethan didn't lift the cup. He didn't call the colt's name. He didn't blink for fear of missing it. The shape drifted like a piece of night that had chosen not to fall. For a heartbeat, and maybe more than a heartbeat, the head turned. If there was any message in the high-held neck, the set of the ears, the patient stillness, it was only this: I keep watch. You keep faith. Dustfoot snorted and nudged Ethan's shoulder, and Ethan laughed, a small sound that belonged to his own life. "All right, boy," he said, rubbing the colt's cheek. "I hear you." There was no ceremony in the closing of the day. The sky finished burning and went dark. Somewhere, a nighthawk worked the air. The rocker creaked once and went still. Dustfoot settled into his corner with a grunt of contentment. The hoofbeats, if they had been real at all, were already part of the land again, braided into the miles. So the story didn't end so much as continue the way water continues after it passes the bend. A scarred cowboy who had outlived his war learned to live with a different kind of duty. A Mustang colt grew into himself without losing the shine of the horizon in his eyes. And out beyond the fence, a great black stallion moved through the dark as untroubled as weather. Between them, lay no papers and no brands. Only the discipline of a promise kept, and the liberty of a promise never demanded. If a traveler were to pass that way at dusk, he might see a lean man on a porch and a young horse at his knee, both listening to the open. He might think them ordinary and be right, and he might think them part of something larger and be right again. And if he lingered long enough, he might also hear it, the soft, slow drum from far off, an affidavit written in hoof and earth that the legend still breathed. Ethan raised his face to the dark and let it find him. "Good night," he said to the colt, to the porch, to the unseen watcher on the ridge. "I'll keep the water full." The wind slipped through the cottonwood. Dustfoot settled deeper in the straw. Somewhere beyond the edge of the known, a single hoof struck rock, and then another, not urgent, not afraid. The sound went on its quiet way over the plains, and the night held it, and the man and the horse sat and listened, content to be exactly what they were, on the seam between two worlds.